Hi, my name is Holly Grober. We did our presentation on the book Poor Economics, A Radical Rethinking of the Way to Fight Global Poverty. So just a quick summary of the book. The authors of this book worked with the poor in dozens of countries to try and understand the problems of poverty and find solutions to these problems. Some of the main factors examined are why the poor need to borrow in order to save, why they fail to take advantage of immunizations but buy drugs that they do not need, and why they start businesses but can't profit from them in the end. The key takeaway from the book is that much of anti-poverty policy has failed because of inadequate understanding of poverty in general. So I looked at the first three chapters. The first chapter is called Think Again, Again. So global poverty should not be viewed as a single problem, but as a combined result of many small problems that have led us to this point. We should address each individual problem instead of trying to tackle global poverty as a whole. One really important quote that I found from this chapter is that there will be a poverty trap whenever the scope for growing income or wealth at a very fast rate is limited for those who have too little to invest, but expands dramatically for those who can invest a little more. On the other hand, if the potential for fast growth is high among the poor and then tapers off as one gets richer, there's no poverty trap. So basically that just explains what a poverty trap is and how it can put those lower income individuals into even more of a poverty situation. And then the last point from this chapter is that lazy thinking is the enemy of progress. So basically this just means that people look at global poverty as this huge issue that they can't even begin to tackle. And they're just like, I don't even know what to do to begin to address this problem. But instead, we should look at it as smaller problems and address those individually. And that would lead to progress with this. Chapter 2, Food and Nutrition, A Billion Hungry People. So in today's modern society, a lack of food tends to not be a major contributor to poverty anymore. But on the other hand, malnutrition is still a problem. Anti-malnutrition programs have helped substantially. Some examples of these are iodine supplementation for pregnant mothers and deworming pills for infants or newborns who are born into poverty and suffer from malnutrition. And then malnutrition can go on to affect these individuals much later in their life because they can't get a quality education if they don't even have the basic food and water that they need. And then that lack of education then leads to a lack of future high wages. Chapter 3, Healthcare, Low-Hanging Fruit for Better Global Health. So talking about the poverty trap that was talked about in the first chapter, a health poverty trap affects the extreme poor as well. A lack of education about health creates the tendency to over-medicate, which creates drug-resistant pathogens. And so low-income individuals who don't know that much about healthcare and doctors think that if they just go to a doctor and that doctor prescribes them medicine, that's quality healthcare. But a lot of the times it's not. So a lack of education is a big problem. Going off that, preventative care is underutilized because of this lack of education and also because of procrastination, because these low-income individuals would rather spend their money on other things because they don't realize the importance of this preventative healthcare. So one thing the author suggested that I thought was really good was that it can be beneficiary to provide incentives to motivate people to seek healthcare. In the book, they said just providing people with free meals for going to get a shot or get vaccinated for something.
So Holly, we have a few questions for you. Is it ethical to provide incentives to people to motivate them to seek preventative care?
So a study that I looked at called Small Cash Incentives Can Encourage Primary Care Visits by Low-Income People with New Healthcare Coverage. That study broke subjects into three groups. One was given $50 incentives, one was given $25 incentives, and the other was given $0 of an incentive to visit their primary care doctor. And the results showed that subjects in the $50 group were 77% more likely to visit a primary care physician, and those that received $25 were 74% more likely to visit than those that received $0. So this just shows that other people besides the authors of this book are looking at this incentive to motivate people to seek primary health care. And because those values are so small, I don't think that it should be an ethical issue for them to get some kind of incentive to seek treatment. And then also, as the authors mentioned in the book, it doesn't even need to be a monetary value. It could just be a free meal or something. So if that's going to help them to seek this care, then I think it's really necessary. And I don't think that there's an ethical issue involved.
And a second question, how can leaders of businesses help eliminate global poverty? In what ways are they making global poverty worse?
So throughout the book, many times it's brought up that we shouldn't look at global poverty as one major issue, but as small individuals or small issues within our own communities. So if these business leaders look at the problems that are faced in their direct community, so maybe for some community it's there's not quality healthcare, maybe another there's no jobs or whatever it is. If they can just tackle a small issue within their community, that can help them to make a small change in a global environment. And what they're doing right now is they're either sitting back and not doing anything, or they just don't even know where to begin. So that's where they need to take some leadership and start within their communities.
Great. Thanks for the insight.
Thank you.
Okay, we did an overview on chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4 is titled Education Top of the Class. So for this chapter, it started out with the fact that absentee rates are between 14 and 50%.
It'll go back. I'm sorry.
And this is related to a couple different factors. One is that parents are not able or willing to make their kids go to school. This is a failure from the top down to increase education from the government to the principals to the teachers, parents, and then all the way down to the kids. It's failing from the top down. There's no underlying demand for education in a lot of those poor countries. The lack of schools, but the quality of the education. In these countries, they have the availability to go to the schools, but the quality of education is not there. This also has to do with the fact that teachers in India, Bangladesh, Peru, and Uganda miss one of every 5 days. So that's 1 day out of every school that the teachers are missing. And the kids cannot learn from that. And also, seeing them missing class, they might assume that they don't have to be in class either. Rich countries keep kids in school by keeping them in school to a specific age, and also by telling their parents that if they stay in school for a longer amount of time, the greater amount of money that they will gain throughout their lifetime. Many of the developed countries have programs designed for elite rather than the regular student. And that's why some of them fail as well, because they're only focused on the elite, not the regular students that can't afford to go to those institutions. For chapter 5, it's family planning and contraception. This book touched on big families and how they can cause problems. Like Ethiopia's fertility rate is 6.12 per woman compared to the U.S., which is at 2.05. And Ethiopia is 1 times more poor than the U.S. as a country. The lower population would provide more jobs available to men and women, and for the women, that would allow them to focus on their career and start working rather than starting a family at an early age, relating to the high fertility rate of 6.12. This is not all the way up to their control. They do not have the access to modern contraceptives like many developed countries have. But even in some studies where they gave them access to the contraceptives, the willingness to use them is not there. Even like programs that tell them about the risk of contracting HIV and AIDS is not stopping them, undetected sex and fertility rates. So that having even that possibility of getting HIV or AIDS is still not stopping.
Okay, Sterling. So how can the performance of field studies affect the way leadership is done?
So for a field study that they did of the schools, it's not because there's a lack of school, but it's the quality of education. So from a leadership standpoint, you can look at that and the programs that have people going out and building a school in underdeveloped countries, it's not necessarily going to help from a leadership standpoint, we need to look at it and say that, oh, okay, well, we need better teachers in there, or re-implement a system of education. And that's how you can use that field study to affect leadership.
Second question, in what ways can leadership differ from underdeveloped countries to developed countries?
In underdeveloped countries, leadership is focusing more on the essential needs that they need, like food, water, shelter. That's what they're mainly focused on in undeveloped countries. But in developed countries, it becomes more complex because their basic needs are already met in most households. So they want different things. So as a leadership standpoint, you need to see what the developed people in developed countries need and want.
Great, thanks, Sterling.
So I covered chapter 6, financial risk, the barefoot hedge fund managers. So one quote that I thought was really interesting from the book is, the poor are like hedge fund managers. They live with huge amounts of risk. So the chapter essentially just compared how owning a business in a poor community is similar to owning a hedge portfolio. So income risk. So risk is a central fact for the life of the poor, and especially those who are running small businesses or farms that work as casual laborers. So for the poor, the risk is not just limited to income and food, but also health, crime, and corruption. So one of the stories from the book is an example of the woman Abu Tina's and her life and business. So Abu Tina's daughter was kidnapped, and this is one of the examples of crime that the poor can face, by a homeless man living in their area, and that left her traumatized and unable to help Abu support their family. Abu also dealt with someone giving her a bad check, which is kind of leads to corruption, in which she seeked help from the police. So she actually paid 4.5 rupa to recover just 4.5 million rupa to recover just 4 million rupa. So the corruption within the law enforcement is another hurdle for the poor. So facing risk, and not only income risk, but also the risk of death, disease, insecurity, makes us worry. And that worrying can make us stressed and depressed. And this process can lead to loss of hope, especially if we're not doing anything to combat that. So if we need to find a way to cope with the risk. So coping with risk. One of these ways is to increase work. So one natural reaction when faced with decreased hours or wages is to work more. So the issue with this is if all the poor laborers work more, and when times are bad, they're competing with one another for jobs, which drives the wages down even further, creating more of an issue. So like a hedge fund manager, another way to cope with risk is to diversify. So in this case, they're not diversifying a portfolio, but rather activities and occupations and plots of land. So by reducing these overall risk, if one plot of land or one job fails or falters, there are others for them to keep going that they can fall back on. Another option includes temporary migration, being conservative, and just being creative with the resources that you do have. So all of these options can be costly, and they're rather ineffective sometimes. So a potentially much better option for them is to help each other out. So most poor people are living in villages of people who know them well, like their family and friends, and they can help each other, and it doesn't have to be a charity. So chapter 7, interest rates and credit, the men of Kabul and the eunuchs from India. So this is the not so simple economics of lending to the poor. So this chapter essentially just outlines lending and some loans given for small business owners in the communities. So people that are poor have limited access to banks. They tend to turn to exploitative money lenders for small loans to help get by and really survive on their business. The problem is that there's really high interest rates. So these interest rates, a quote from the book, is that yearly rates from anywhere from 40 to 200% are the norm. So this lends people to turn to microfinancing. And microfinancing is a great solution for some of the poor because it's flexible, it's more sustainable than the loans that they're getting from these exploitative money lenders, and there's a very low interest rate, but it's a lot of work on the lender's part. So they have to follow up with them and really keep tabs on them to ensure that they're going to get their money paid back. So MFI, or microfinance institutions. So a typical MFI contract involves loans to a group of people or a group of borrowers, and they're all liable for one another's loans and debt. So it's kind of an interesting setup. And default in your loan results in a threat to cut off all future lending. So they're making sure they're staying on time. It's a strict payment schedule, and everyone's really working together. Because these aren't flexible, it allows the MFIs to organize the payments at a lower cost. So there are some limits of microcredit, and that's the rigid rules. There's, like I said, a very strict guideline for each loan, the repercussions of that loan, and the time cost. It's expensive for the lender to be putting that work investment in and really keeping tabs on them and keeping track of their client to make sure that they have all the information they need in order to repay that loan. And it's a joint liability. So this is something kind of interesting. When you're in a group of lenders together, you're all responsible for each other's debt. That's not something typically we'd want to take on, especially in today's society. That's not something very common. And there's a lot of time constraints. So these are very limited loans in the time frame. So it's something kind of similar to a payday loan that we have today. An issue is that larger businesses that are run by the poor, it tends to be too large for the microfinancing, but too small for the banks.
So Mackenzie, what stops people from doing more to help one another? Why are some forms of risk not covered or not covered well?
So people are unwilling or sometimes hesitant to offer support for many different reasons. But one thing is what insurers refer to as moral hazard. So that's the recipient slacking off. And that's one of the most common. And that's just that they have this loan now, so they kind of get comfortable and they don't work as hard as they maybe would have if they were doing it on their own. Some people also fear that they're being taken advantage of, that someone may be asking for help even if they don't need it. And also, it's sometimes as simple as the fear of them not returning the favor. So if I help you out, and then later when I'm in need, I want you to help me out, and just the fear that you wouldn't reciprocate that favor. And as for certain types of risk, people may be more willing to help if someone is sick or injured compared to if someone owes money because of their own personal debt. So factors like circumstance and the value really affect someone's willingness.
Great. And the second question for you, are there ethical implications of microfinancing?
So as I discussed previously, some of the interest rates are 40 to 200%, and it's really assessing the return on investment of the person taking out the loan. So what are the ethics behind lending, and what does an ethical lender then look like? So based on our course materials and just the reading in the book, I kind of formulated some values that I think would be an ethical lender. So that would be someone who is honest, straightforward, open, fair, and act with integrity. So it's kind of like payday lending. The model of microfinancing and lending itself is not unethical, but it can become unethical when the cost is disproportionate to the risk involved.
Great, thank you.
In this chapter, a man tells a story of how houses are built over incremental periods of time. Savings are attempted in these poor environments. However, savings are used up when other issues arise, such as health problems. In some villages, self-help groups help individuals get their money into their accounts. Microfinance institutions have allowed up to 25% of poor Kenyans to save. The psychology of savings remains a problem. We have a built-in notion that we will buy today and save tomorrow. This creates a pathway of the more self-control we try to have, the more stress we generate, leading to increased cortisol levels and more impulsivity. Now the poor are buying sweets and teas and other things that are easily obtainable, but diminish their savings for the future. What is needed for this group is a way to save in the short term, or as the book refers to it, making the goalposts closer. The poor are natural entrepreneurs. This is the next slide. The poor are natural entrepreneurs, but possibly not enough to be profitable. Very few can get out of poverty. The story of one who began teaching sewing in a remote village and prepared herself to a future of selling her designs to stores like J.C. Penney's is a rare one. Urban schools are notably more adept at education compared with rural schools. Why doesn't everyone move there if the future is bright? There is an increased cost of moving, uprooting family, and associated risk of losing a job. Is the entrepreneurial life the answer to removing the poverty gap? Doubtful. Millions may get out, but there's still 1 billion living on 99 cents a day. What was concluded is that where there is corruption, there is poor growth. The implementation of information technology, such as retinal scanners and fingerprints, can help the poor get their designated food items rather than relying on local vendors, only claiming that they sold to the poor. Helping the poor into elections has created more opportunities for their group, such as more health expenditures, leading to lower term birth weights and newborns. To really institute a change and removal of the poverty gap, the self-fulfilling prophecy has major implications. In education, you could say if you aren't smart enough, you should drop out. In paying debt, if you can't make one payment, you should just stop paying. In work, if you don't feel valued, you just end up staying at home. In politics, if you don't feel needed, you have no determination to make a change. Now, of course, if you believe this, that's just where you'll fall. Here are some questions.
Some questions for you, Lee. Is one would how do you values to differ between the top 1% and the bottom 1%?
Well, based on the reading from the book and life experiences, values typically conveyed by the poor would include family, teamwork, and hard work. The values typically exhibited by a wealthy man or woman may be education, innovation, and income.
Question: what are your thoughts on cultural relativism and how that concept relates to assisting?
Well, we can't always assume that the poor want aid. They may be comfortable living the life they are living. Cultural relativism states that we must adjust moral standards based on the country we are currently entering. If I travel to China, I must respect and live by their standards. So how can one of another country or the United Nations determine what is best for an entire cohort of individuals? We simply cannot. Our ways of life and values do not entirely overlap. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation. We hope that it incites, induces some conversation, discussion throughout the class. Thank you very much.
Thank you.